Hi, I'm Dr. Tony Evans, your host for Heroes in the Bible. If you've enjoyed this podcast so far, please share it with your family and friends and help us spread God's word. Welcome to the epic adventure of David, a story of honor, battle, jealousy, darkness, friendship, love, scandal, and murder. While most people know of David the myth, few know about David the man. In this episode, everything seems to unravel. The episode begins similarly to our last episode. We're about to discover even more reasons to fear him. He has a brilliant mind and the resources to carry out his will. Absalom's rage rises in temperature with each passing day, and David's own nature is used against him. Absalom is a perfectly crafted enemy for David, leveraging every weakness and strength against him. His rise to power is a slow burn, and David ends up feeling the heat. Temperature rises, and we all wonder if this is the end for David. However, the greatest metals are purified in fire, and the greatest weapons are forged in the flame. When the darkness closes in and seeks to consume our hero, his true strength is revealed. However, this strength does not come from where you might expect. Superhero movies and teen fiction novels have told us that the greatest power comes from within. Not David's. His strength is found outside of himself, through the sovereign power of his God and the loyalty of his friends. This episode begins with our most important prelude yet. We're in the same place as David, but in a different time. A time when Jesus is faced with his enemy. He models the strength of a true king. While others may run from their problems, he faces them head on. Jesus is not a victim to the villains that seek his life. No, he is the ultimate hero. Here's episode 26, The Exiled Father.
Prelude to chapter 26. Jesus' shivering body walked to the opening between the trees. He looked up to see the moon peeking out from the clouds. His jaw quivered. He closed his eyes and fell to the ground. Jesus' face was on the floor. He clenched fistfuls of dirt and grass as he prayed vigorously to the Lord. Tears streamed down his wincing face.
My Father,
He cried.
if it be possible, let this cup pass from me.
A soft and steady stream of tears watered the grass below. His weeping was quiet, but poured forth from a deep well of pain within him. Since before time itself, Jesus had existed in perfect unity with the Father. Yet now, as he wept beside a cold stone and wet grass, he was feeling the anticipation of separation. He looked to heaven again and sighed.
Nevertheless, I will submit to your will completely.
Jesus knew that if there was any other way besides death, God would have supplied it. Yet this was the only way. One must die so all may live. Jesus buried his face in his hands and took a deep breath. He looked over to Peter, James, and John a few yards away. They were leaning against the trees fast asleep. Jesus rose up, faltering towards them. He tapped Peter's foot with his. Peter arose with a gasp, drawing his sword. He saw Jesus standing in front of him. Peter sheathed his sword, embarrassed.
You could not watch with me for 1 hour, Peter?
Jesus said with a sigh.
All of you, pray, lest you enter into temptation. You may think you have strength, but although the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak.
John watched Jesus walk slowly back to the stone. He rested his elbows against the flat part of the stone and lifted his eyes to heaven.
Father,
Jesus prayed.
if this cup is mine to drink, I shall drink it. Your will be done.
His eyes winced shut. He prayed in agony into the night. His hands shook, and from his forehead dropped blood from his pores. His prayers were so deep and so powerful that his very body was beginning to break. The clouds above began to stir once again, and the moon disappeared. Jesus banged his fist against the hard stone, allowing the sound to echo through the garden. From the wind came an angel from heaven. He came to minister to Jesus and strengthen him. The entire cosmos was about to shift. Even the angels themselves were preparing for what was to come. Jesus stood up to his feet and inhaled the strength of God's Spirit. His weary eyes became more focused and intent. He turned again to his disciples. Peter, James, and John had fallen asleep again. Jesus smiled and turned his face to heaven. He prayed a third time, being emboldened by God. Then he walked over to the three. Jesus stood over them a while. James woke up to see Jesus.
Get your rest, James. You will need it.
Jesus said.
The hour has come. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of sinners. Now rise. My betrayer is at hand.
The ground shook underneath them. They could hear the marching of soldiers approaching. Jesus turned calmly to his left, like a wolf emerging from his den. Judas came forth from the shadows of the trees. Behind him were over 100 torches. Jesus stood at a distance with his disciples. The soldiers were about 100 yards away. It was enough distance for Jesus to run. If they fled now to the wilderness, they could find shelter back in Bethany with Lazarus. The blood-stained brook Kidron trickled downhill. It stood as a separator between Jesus and his betrayer. Jesus went to the edge of the brook. He looked down at the red water flowing loudly. He looked up, watching dozens of temple soldiers line up behind Judas. With a large step, Jesus crossed the brook Kidron and went towards his enemies. The Son of God would not run from death. He would face it with power. He plucked an olive from the tree next to him. He pressed it tightly in his hand. He opened his palm to see oil spilling forth from the olive. Gethsemane means oil press. Fitting, since Jesus was about to be pressed for everything he had. Chapter 26. The Exiled Father. The Prince of Israel was a sight to behold. Truly, there was no one in all the land who knew how to make an entrance quite like him. His long, curly, dark hair blew in the wind as he rode back into Jerusalem, mounted on a white Egyptian stallion. He wore fine robes held together with purple and gold strings. On top of his robes was a gleaming breastplate with golden scales shimmering in the sunlight. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. He was renowned as the most handsome man in the East, and he always showcased that fact with flair and enthusiasm. People gathered around the city gates to greet him as he rode in. The prince beamed with charisma, and the people drank him in. Absalom was not like the other sons of David. While they were content to live in anonymity, he craved the attention of the masses. He was fueled by it. His wife, 3 sons, and his daughter Tamar, whom he named after his sister, rode in behind him. A sea of faces cheered Absalom, praising his return. Yet David was nowhere to be seen. He would not validate the people's love for Absalom by being there. In fact, he would not greet Absalom at all. David did not know how to proceed with his son. His crime was great and caused a great amount of grief among his household. Yet he was still his son whom he loved. And he knew not how to both hold him accountable for his sins and welcome him back in. So Absalom remained in the heart of the city for 2 years without stepping foot in his father's house. The two did not see each other or send messengers. David's silence vexed Absalom. With every passing month, the anger of the prince was provoked even more. David was foolish to ignore his son, for the distance between them only made Absalom more unhinged. Absalom looked out the window of his home with his hands folded behind him. He stared out at the fields. The golden ears of grain swayed to and fro from the wind. He was deep in thought, considering the silence between him and his father.
Shall the heir of Israel be ignored for so long?
He whispered to himself.
How long will I endure such dishonor? How long will I endure the foolishness of my father?
Absalom beckoned for his servant. The boy bowed at a distance. It was not uncommon for Absalom to be violent towards his servants.
Bring me Joab. If my father will not speak with me, then perhaps he will speak to him on my behalf. Go, and hurry back with news.
The young man departed, only a mile ahead to Joab's estate. His home rested at the end of the barley fields nestled between 2 hills. There, Joab enjoyed a moment of peace. The quietness of the evening was a pleasant relief for his chaotic life. Joab had many responsibilities in the kingdom, and he was growing more advanced in years. He sat back in the front of his home and closed his eyes. However, his peace was disquieted when he saw Absalom's servant approaching. The young boy bowed his head and spoke, saying,
I have come on behalf of my master, Absalom, son of David and prince of Israel. He desires to speak with you so you might intercede on his behalf with King David.
Joab rubbed his forehead and groaned.
Tell your master that I am done playing middleman between him and his father. I've gotten him here to Jerusalem, and that should be enough.
Joab waved the servant away, and he departed back into his master's home. The boy brought the news to Absalom, saying,
Joab has refused your request for a meeting, my lord.
The prince chuckled and nodded his head. He sighed and walked over to the servant. He placed a hand on his shoulders and squeezed. The young servant winced in pain, unable to break free from Absalom's grip. He leaned down and said,
I am sure you forgot to tell him how important this is to me.
He gritted his teeth and sunk his fingers down harder into the boy's neck.
Now go again tomorrow, and I expect a better result.
He released his grip, and the boy fell to his knees. Absalom cracked his neck to the side, straightened his robe, and smiled.
Good night. I shall see you tomorrow afternoon when you have a word from Joab.
The prince retreated to his bedroom. The servant arose the next morning before sunlight and ran to Joab's estate. He waited at the door, listening for any stirring from within the home. Finally, one of Joab's servants opened the door.
Who are you?
He asked.
I come from the house of Absalom, son of David and prince of Israel. He desires to speak with your lord about meeting with the king.
The boy said nervously. Joab's servant went back into the home and came back out moments later.
My lord cannot see your lord. I am sorry. Wait! Please, tell Joab that a refusal would mean bad things for me, him, and his household. My lord is unhinged and unpredictable. You do not want to anger him. I am sorry.
The servant said again.
There will be no meeting.
And he shut the door. The boy held his head low in defeat and slowly trudged back home to his master. The afternoon heat was harsh and unforgiving. The sun beat down on the boy's scarred neck. He rubbed it and winced in pain. He dreaded what awaited him at home. The boy came before Absalom and gave him the news. Instead of raging against him or screaming in anger, the prince nodded and retreated to his room. There was a calm quietness about him that sent chills down the servant's spine.
Did you know my fields are next to Joab's?
Absalom asked.
Yes, my lord.
The boy said quietly.
Burn his side.
Pardon me, my lord?
Absalom turned around and gave a sadistic smile.
Take a torch and set Joab's fields on fire. Do so in the morning before the sun rises.
Absalom could sense the confusion in the young boy. He placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said,
You of all people should know that force, when used tactfully, gets desired results.
So the servant left the following morning with a torch in hand. He laced the perimeter of the fields with animal grease, then lit the entire field on fire. It was only 2 weeks away from harvesting season, and all of Joab's hard work rose in a torrent of flames. The fire consumed everything, fueled by the dry air. When Joab awoke, he burst out of the door and screamed for his workers to douse the fire, yet they were too late. The fire made quick work of the field, and in only an hour, it was completely devoured. Joab kicked open the door to Absalom's home with rage.
What have you done, Absalom?
He yelled.
Of all the petty and sadistic things you have done, this one tops them all.
Joab was fuming in anger, nearly ready to unsheath his sword and cut through Absalom's neck. However, the handsome prince was unfazed by Joab's tantrum. He remained calm and gestured to the table.
Please, have a seat, Joab.
Absalom said cordially. Joab was disturbed by Absalom's calm demeanor. He sat down, slightly afraid of what may happen next. Absalom gestured for his servants to bring Joab a cup and some bread. It remained untouched in front of him.
Joab, why have I come out of exile?
Absalom asked.
Geshur was a lovely place, and I had everything I needed. It would have been better for me to stay in exile and thrive there, rather than rot within the borders of Jerusalem. I came back to engage in the life of this nation. to convene with my father, to strategize with you, and to lead this nation. How can I do that when you and my father insist on ignoring me?
Joab's posture shifted. He relaxed his shoulders and thought for a moment. Absalom made a decent argument. There would be no reason to allow him to return if he was not allowed to engage in the political and military life of the nation. Joab shrugged and said,
You are right. However, the king does not desire to see you, Absalom. I do not need to remind you that your crimes were grave. You killed his son.
You and I both know I did this nation a favor by putting an end to that fool. Would you really want Amnon as your next king after David? He was weak and a rapist pig. I did the Lord's work and brought justice.
Joab did not seem so certain. Absalom leaned forward and reasoned with Joab, saying,
If my crimes were so grave, then let me go before the king and have him judge me himself. If he finds guilt still remaining in me, let me be put to death. I will accept that fate.
Joab stirred in his seat, wondering if it would be a good idea. Finally, he nodded and took Absalom's hand and shook it.
It shall be done,
He said. Then he stood to exit the home. As he opened the door, he turned back and looked at Absalom.
I expect to be paid for my burnt fields.
Absalom raised his cup to Joab and nodded. The commander groaned, then left. Joab left immediately to the house of David. He bowed before the king and said,
Your son, Absalom, desires an audience with you, my king. I think it would be wise to reconcile.
David was filled with inner doubt. There was a check in his spirit about Absalom. But how could a father deny his son for that long?
I long to forgive him, Joab. I just need to see he has humbled himself.
Allow him the chance. If you still find fault in him, he has opened himself up to judgment.
Joab said.
Bring him to me, then.
David said.
I will meet with my son.
Joab departed and sent word for Absalom to come. The prince rode to the palace on his white steed. The people awed as he passed through the streets. They cheered his name and waved. He drank in their praise. He needed it more than the air he breathed. He finally passed the gardens of his childhood home and dismounted his horse. He pushed open the doors and walked down the hall leading to David's throne room. Nothing had changed about it. He saw the tapestries of past conquests still illuminated by torchlight. He felt the warmth of the fire in the iron basin. And just as spectacular as Absalom remembered him, King David sat on his throne. The young prince walked slowly up to the middle of the room and looked at his father. Neither of them said a word. Absalom knew what he had to do in order to gain David's trust again. He knew how to tug at his father's sensitive heart. He knew that his father was waiting for any excuse to forgive him and look past his sins. So he fell dramatically to his knees and opened up his arms. His bottom lip quivered, and he forced a single tear to fall down his cheek.
Father,
Absalom whispered.
I am here. Forgive me.
As he said this, the prince fell down on his face and prostrated himself before David. The king's generous and kind heart was ignited within him, and he rushed from his throne down to his son. He wrapped his arms around him and wept.
I forgive you, my son. Welcome home.
David kissed him and helped him to his feet. Absalom embraced him again. The prince had his father right where he wanted him, and now that he was back in the palace again, all could go according to plan. The old farmer slowly approached the gates of Jerusalem. He wiped the sweat off his brow and let out a sigh of relief. After days of travel, he had finally made it to the city of David. The old man descended down the hill leading to the gates. He was anxious to see the king, and time was of the essence. As the weary traveler came to the gate, he was called to by a dashing young man adorned in royal clothing. He sat in the shade with a few of his guards beside him.
You there, traveler.
He shouted.
Where do you come from?
The man bowed his head and said,
I am a farmer from the tribe of Ephraim. My farm is just outside the village of Shiloh.
The young man beckoned him, saying,
You look weary from your travels. Come, I have cool water from the well and wine for you to enjoy.
The farmer shook his head and said,
Oh, thank you, my lord, but I must be on my way. I have to speak to the king. I hear he allows citizens to entreat him once a month and hear their disputes.
It is a shame you have traveled so far to be disappointed.
The young man said.
The king has stopped seeing any citizens. He is overwhelmed with his own troubles. He barely has time to listen to the people. Come, tell me your matter. Perhaps I can be of service to you.
The farmer was confused and disappointed.
Who are you? How can you help me?
I am the prince and heir to the throne.
The young man said.
My name is Absalom. Perhaps you have heard of me.
The old man gasped and bowed, saying,
I am sorry, my lord. I am from a small village. I would have never known it was you.
Please, think nothing of it. Tell me your trouble.
Absalom said with a smile. The farmer then began to tell him of a dispute he had regarding the land surrounding his farm. A noble from another village took the land by force, even though it was given to him by his father and his grandfather. Since the man was rich and had mercenaries to enforce his will, he could do nothing about it.
That is why I need to speak to the king.
The old man said.
I need his help to drive out the noble and give me my land back.
Absalom feigned compassion and understanding. He nodded and placed a hand on his shoulder.
I feel for you, good friend. You should not have to travel so far just to inquire about this. The king should have had representatives in your region to hear you and act on his behalf. That is what a wise king would do. That is what I would do if I were king.
I wish you were king, good Absalom. Then perhaps I would not be so hopeless.
The farmer said, holding back tears.
One day soon I may be king.
He said with a reassuring smile.
Have hope, and tell others hope as well. For the Lord may cause my ascension to the throne sooner than we think. For the king is quite mad, and may not be fit for the throne any longer.
The farmer left disappointed and infuriated at the king. Absalom's lies, combined with his charisma and charm, were a perfect storm. Day by day, he stood at the gates doing the same thing he did with the farmer. He told them that David did not have time for them, heard their troubles, and sent them away hoping he would one day be king. One of Absalom's guards watched the old man leave. He shook his head and said,
Why must we be here every day in the hot sun? You have horses, chariots, and mercenaries at the ready to storm the city. Why not take it by force?
Absalom rolled his eyes and scoffed.
Because there is no use taking the throne if they still love the king,
He said.
The first battle is for the hearts of the people. The second battle is for the conquest of the city. Have patience. Our time will come.
So day by day, Absalom continued. He was a patient man, willing to take years in order to enact his plan. For 4 years he rose early to be at the gates, and as the travelers left Jerusalem, they brought stories of his kindness and leadership. Absalom's good reputation was spreading like a virus, as was the negative reputation of David. Winter was approaching, and the warm east breeze shifted into a cool and biting wind from the west. Huddled near the fireplace of his home was Absalom and Ahithophel the Gilonite, one of King David's counselors. He had been conspiring alongside him to overthrow the king. They spoke into the night, planning and conniving against David. Ahithophel shared Absalom's vision. They could not make it look like a military coup or a treason. It needed to look like a natural secession. They needed to control the message and make it common sense to elevate Absalom as king.
200 men should be enough.
Absalom said.
We will have them go throughout the city and declare that I have been made king. They will say it as if it were news coming from the palace itself. In fact, they could make it sound like King David was the one who wanted it.
Ahithophel smiled and said,
Once the city is chanting your name, we will find David and kill him. That will be the final piece.
Ahithophel had his own reasons for hating David. Bathsheba was his granddaughter, and he hated what the king had done to her and Uriah. He wanted vengeance.
It must be done secretly,
Absalom said.
and his closest advisors must be killed as well.
Absalom poked the fire with a rod, crushing the coals and watching them break apart.
People must think you are elsewhere when this occurs, Absalom.
Ahithophel warned.
No one would expect you to be the culprit if you are away. Perhaps you should be gone doing something holy and moral. Perhaps you can go to Hebron to make a sacrifice. No one would suspect you to murder the king while you are away worshiping the Lord.
The two of them agreed and gathered 200 men to proclaim their message. It had to be timed perfectly, and all had to fall in place at the perfect moment. The next morning, Absalom was enjoying a morning stroll with his father. The two spoke of the future of Israel, poetry, and military strategy. David was pleased to have his son back in his presence. He was ignorant to the evil and corrupt works happening in secret. Absalom turned to his father and said,
When I was in Geshur, I made a vow to the Lord. I told him that if I ever was able to return to Jerusalem and reconcile with you, that I would make a sacrifice to him in Hebron. I would very much like to follow through on that promise. Would you allow me to leave for a few weeks and worship the Lord?
David's heart leapt at the idea of his son honoring the Lord.
Of course.
David said enthusiastically.
Go in peace, my son.
Absalom bowed and left immediately to prepare. He and the 200 secret messengers left the city gates the next morning. The 200 men separated into all the tribes of Israel.
When the trumpets sound, declare to everyone, Absalom has been made king at Hebron. Go and dwell in the homes of innocent people. Tell them that Absalom has been named king of the people, and David is no more. Tell them, so they may tell their friends, and their friends, and their friends. Allow the seeds of deception to spread until it is true to them.
The messengers left, and Absalom made the journey to Hebron. It took him a day for him to arrive at Hebron. There, he made a sacrifice to the Lord, just as he said he would. The trumpet sounded, and it was time for chaos to ensue. It was late, and the moon's light trickled in through the lattice of David's bedroom. The night was quiet. However, there was an uneasiness in the air. David lay there asleep, content to dream of battles fought and victories won. However, his peaceful sleep was swiftly interrupted as the large wooden door swung open violently.
My king!
David leapt out of his bed and grabbed his sword. He pointed it forward. Illuminated by torchlight was Shammah.
Arise, David, they are coming for you!
David lowered his sword and shouted.
What is the meaning of this?
As the king asked the question, he heard a pounding at the front of the palace gate and a clamoring of men. Shammah grunted in frustration and looked out the window.
They are here! David, we must go!
Who is here?
King David was flustered and frustrated. Shammah grabbed him by the shoulders and yelled.
It's Absalom, your son! The hearts of the people have been corrupted! David, they are shouting his name in the streets, declaring him king!
All became clear to David in that moment. The peace between him and Absalom was all a ruse, an act to lull David to sleep. The king dressed himself in Jonathan's old armor and strapped the sword of Goliath to his back.
Shammah, listen to me. I will not make this city a battleground for civil war. We will flee now and live to fight another day. Now, where is Joab?
I do not know, but I do know that your palace guards do not stand a chance against Absalom's hired mercenaries. We must leave now.
The two of them jumped out the window and rolled onto the ground below. David grabbed his servants and said,
Gather the rest of the men and have them escort my family to the brook Kidron. We will flee there. Go!
The servants did as they were told. The entire household of David was taken out of their beds and escorted out of the city. The concubines remained to care for the house. David and Shammah mounted their horses to escape, but the mercenaries had already broken through the gates. David unsheathed his sword and rode towards them with fire in his belly. However, he was cut off by Abishai and Benaiah. The two mighty men rode ferociously into the fray of mercenaries, slashing at them and clearing a way for David to escape. The king smiled. He knew he could always count on his mighty men. He and Shammah broke through, knocking a few mercenaries down in the process. Abishai and Benaiah were close behind, covering their tail. Arrows whistled past them.
Just like old times.
Abishai jested. The men laughed and escaped to the borders of the city. The men arrived at the brook Kidron. There, David greeted his family and hugged them. He held young Solomon closely and kissed him on the head.
Do not be afraid, my children. The Lord shall protect us.
As David comforted his family, there was a stirring coming from the trees. All the servants of the king came to him. Refugees and citizens of fallen nations that had been servants of the king followed after him. The Cherethites, the Pelethites, and the Gittites gathered near the brook. Hundreds of people were there to follow the king into the wilderness. David was overwhelmed. He shook his head.
No, why are you here? Go back and serve Absalom. You are a foreigner and an exile from your homeland. Why uproot yourself again and join me in exile? Return. May the Lord show his steadfast love to you.
Ittai, who was their chief, answered the king, saying,
As the Lord lives, and as you live, wherever you go, we will follow. To the death or to life, we are forever your servants.
We are here as well.
A voice called from behind David. It was Abiathar, the very same priest who helped him when he was in the wilderness. Behind him was Zadok and the Levites. What came after them overwhelmed David beyond all comprehension. Zadok and the Levites bore on their shoulders the Ark of the Covenant. Abiathar embraced David and held his face.
You are the Lord's king, David. We shall escort you as you leave.
David looked at the brook Kidron. Its crystal clear water reflected David's sorrow back at him. He was not the type of man to run, but now he had no choice. With tears in his eyes and fear in his heart, King David stepped over the brook to run from his enemies. He, his family, his servants, and the priests fled into the forest towards the Mount of Olives. As they approached the bottom of the mount, David looked back at the Levites carrying the ark. He kept his distance and beheld it. His heart was filled with intense sorrow and intense reverence. He held back tears and tightened his grip. He looked to Zadok and said,
Carry the ark back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see the temple built. If the Lord is displeased with me, then, well, here I am.
David stretched out his arms and chuckled.
Turn back, Zadok. The ark needs to be among the people. Go back with your sons and send word to me of what happens.
We will return, David. Abiathar and I will send our sons to give you reports. Rest assured, we will keep the ark of God safe until you return.
David embraced them and sent them away. He then looked forward. The Mount of Olives was before him. The moon's light rested elegantly over the olive trees, shimmering down on an opening at the top. Everyone behind him was weeping with their heads covered. They suffered the cold and followed David up the hill. David took off his sandals and covered his head in penance to God. He knew that this was part of the curse Nathan spoke of. Bloodshed had plagued his household. Before they reached the summit, a figure came running towards him. David drew out his sword and had his family get behind him. However, David was pleased to see the face of Hushai, David's friend and a member of his council. He was a tall and gangly man with a short beard. He was clumsy and quirky, but filled with hidden and unappreciated wisdom. While others mocked Hushai, David saw him as special and worthy of listening to. He had run for his life from the city. His clothes were torn and his face was covered in dirt.
My king, thank the Lord you are alive. I thought Absalom would have killed you by now.
What are you doing here?
David asked.
Why are you not back in Jerusalem?
Because I am loyal to you, my king, to the very end.
Hushai seemed offended at the question. Of course he would run to David's aid. He was one of David's counselors alongside Ahithophel. David smiled and hugged his friend.
Yes, you are a loyal friend, Hushai. But if you follow me up this mountain, you are just another mouth to feed. However, if you go back into the city and offer your services to Absalom, you can frustrate Ahithophel and inform me about Absalom's plans.
Hushai nodded in agreement.
Yes, my king. How should I contact you?
The sons of Abiathar and Zadok the priests will be bringing me information. Whatever you learn from Absalom, bring back to me.
David said.
Now go, clean yourself up, and go before my son.
So Hushai fled back into the city. He entered through the gates unnoticed. The city streets were in an uproar. Half the people were praising God for Absalom's new reign. The other half were upset and confused about King David. Hushai slipped back into his home and cleaned himself up. Absalom would be taking the throne soon, and Hushai needed to be there when it happened. Hushai looked at himself in the mirror. His gaze was intense. He was determined to help his king restore peace to the nation. God's Spirit was upon him, and he exited his home to go greet Absalom. They reached the summit, and David felt the cool breeze guiding him forward. He felt the prompting of God, beckoning him to pray. So David proceeded without his family into the trees. David's shivering body walked to the opening between the trees. He looked up to see the moon peeking out from the clouds. His jaw quivered. It was cold and the air was unforgiving. He closed his eyes and fell to the ground. David's face was on the floor. He clenched fistfuls of dirt and grass as he prayed vigorously to the Lord. Tears streamed down his wincing face. He lifted up his head to the skies and sang to God. It was all he knew how to do. His worship was a fragrance to God, a sweet-smelling incense.
O Lord, my foes are many. They are rising against me. They say to my soul, there's no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me. You are the lifter of my head and my glory. I cried aloud to you, and you answered me from your holy hill.
David paused his singing and stood up, stretching his arms out to the Lord. He raised his fists in the air and sang with more fire and intensity than he had ever before.
I will not be afraid of the thousands that pursue me. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Arise, O Lord, arise. Save me, O my God. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Arise.
It looks like our king has finally returned. This episode had us expecting the worst. Absalom is a formidable opponent and perhaps more dangerous than any of the Philistines. Absalom is a more sophisticated villain than someone like Goliath. The giant was a threat for obvious reasons. The danger he presented was clearly seen, and there was nothing hidden or ambiguous about him. David knew what he was up against when he faced Goliath. Absalom, however, is a much more sinister and secretive villain. He is charismatic, shrewd, and conniving. His greatest strength is his knowledge of David. Being his son, Absalom knows all of David's strengths and weaknesses. For this reason, he knows that he can't simply fight his father. He would surely lose. Absalom needed to leverage his father's weaknesses against him. First, he manipulated him with an apology. He knew his father's tender heart could not help but forgive him. If Absalom gave an emotional show, he knew David would fall for it hook, line, and sinker. Second, Absalom knew he needed to corrupt David's reputation. His father's good reputation was his greatest strength. Even if he was able to defeat David in battle, nobody would accept him as king. He needed to ruin his father's name, then march against him. Absalom brilliantly says the first battle is for the hearts of the people. Familiar imagery made its way into this episode. There was a scene where Absalom was scheming against his father by a fire. Absalom poked the fire with a rod, crushing the coals and watching them break apart. This is foreboding imagery. Saul neglected the coals. David tended to the coals, but Absalom crushed the coals. He is a new type of character and harder to predict. He isn't just evil or troubled. He's chaotic, unhinged, brilliant, and self-interested. We've often admired how David isn't simple but nuanced, layered, and unpredictable. Those qualities that make David interesting make Absalom dangerous. His motivations are deep, his resources are vast, and his intelligence is unparalleled. He even has the wit to hide behind religion so nobody would suspect him to be a villain. He made a sacrifice to God to throw people off the scent. Many evil people do this in church today. They hide their greedy, power-hungry, and worthless motives under the guise of religion and righteousness. Beware of opportunistic and self-interested leaders. When the chaos ensues and David is forced to run, we are pleased that David is strapping Jonathan's armor to his chest and the sword of Goliath to his back. We have been longing to see our hero again, and this might be the circumstances to bring him back. We're also pleased to see his mighty men coming to the rescue. Where David had been weak and vulnerable, they have been strong and dependable. David escapes with his family and is greeted by the tribes of outcasts he rescued and the priest. His family, his mighty men, his priest, and his friends are all beside him. They hold him up, declare their loyalty, and vow to protect him. David drew strength from his allies. This is why we make alliances, show kindness to the outcast, and devote ourselves to the people. When we fall, they can help lift us up. As David flees, he passes the brook Kidron, and immediately we are supposed to be taken back to the prelude. It was at this same place, Jesus was pursued by his enemies. A legion of soldiers marched to take him captive. Jesus stood over the brook Kidron just as David did hundreds of years prior. Jesus saw his enemies just as David did. But Jesus did not cross the brook to run from his enemies. He crossed the brook to face them. With a large step, Jesus crossed the brook Kidron and went toward his enemies. The Son of God would not run from death. He would face it with power. The King of Israel stood at the brook beside the Ark of the Covenant, the manifest presence of God, to run from his enemies. And hundreds of years later, the manifest presence of God, Jesus, and the promised descendant of King David stood by the brook to run toward his enemies. If you haven't heard me before, hear me now. Jesus is the greater David. The episode ends with David in the presence of God. He kneels in the dirt atop the Mount of Olives, just as Jesus did, and seeks the Lord. He sings Psalm 3 to God, begging him to rescue and fight for him. The passion is mounting at the end of the episode, and the warrior king shouts to the heavens for his God to move. It's an emotional and compelling song, sung from the core of David's heart. He shouts a final, "Arise!" And we all know for certain that the king of Israel is coming back. If Absalom had paid attention to David's life as closely as we have, he would have been very afraid. Exile is what turned David into a king. Witness God move for his chosen hero in our next episode, Hanging on a Tree. Thanks again for listening. For more inspiring stories, daily prayers, and wisdom to last a lifetime, go to pray.com. And to expand your Heroes in the Bible journey, download the Heroes of the Faith devotional at tonyevans.org/heroes. Share this podcast with a family member or friend and help us spread God's word. God bless.
Hello, my name is Matthew Potter, co-founder of pray.com. I wanted to ask, do you know what your bank does with your money? At America's Christian Credit Union, your everyday banking helps grow churches, expand the reach of missions agencies, and supports fellow believers across the country. Learn more about specials for switching to ACCU and their nationwide banking capabilities at americaschristiancu.com/pray. Plus, the peace of mind knowing that this credit union is federally insured by the National Credit Union Administration.